There is a room nobody ever makes a movie about. Not because it is uninteresting, but because it is too real for Hollywood. 3 meters wide, 4 meters long, ceilings so low that any man above average height has to duck when he enters. Wood everywhere, cracked and soaked through with salt and tar so completely that the smell never leaves even when the ship has been sitting in port for months. The humidity is such that paper always feels slightly soft under your fingers. Look out through the stern windows and you see nothing but water and sky and nothing else. No land, no other ships, nothing to remind you that another world exists. This is the captain's cabin on a Golden Age pirate ship, and if you think you know what happened in there, you are almost certainly wrong. Because this is not a room for storing treasure, not a place for toasting with rum and singing songs about the sea. This is the room where the man in command sat alone with the one question that never had a good answer. How do you hold power over 100 armed men, every single one of whom has the legal right to vote you out, or simply kill you? Everything you have ever heard about pirates was born in this room. Not on the deck under the black flag. Not in a dockside tavern with music and firelight. Here, behind a locked door, in the dark and the damp and the constant creak of wood holding you above the deep. The Golden Age of piracy ran roughly from 1680 to 1730, 50 years during which the Caribbean became simultaneously the most dangerous and most profitable place on Earth. Spanish galleons carried silver and gold from the New World. British merchant ships carried sugar and tobacco and indigo across the Atlantic, and moving through all of it were the pirate vessels. Small, fast, lethal. On every one of them was one man responsible for everything. The route, the provisions, the division of plunder, the mood of 100 men who could pick up weapons at any moment if something went wrong. That man was called the captain, and his room tells you more about piracy than any treasure or flag or spyglass sitting in a museum. The captain's cabin always sat at the stern, the very back of the ship. There were 2 reasons for this, and both were completely practical. First, privacy. The stern was the farthest point from the main body of the crew. Between the captain and the ordinary sailors lay the entire length of the ship, hundreds of feet of wooden decks and gangways and holds. Second, elevation. The captain's quarters on most Golden Age vessels sat slightly above the level of the main deck. Just a few feet, no theatrical platforms, no dramatic staircases, but every time a sailor looked toward the stern, he automatically looked slightly upward at the captain's door. This was not accidental. This was the architecture of authority, the feeling that someone up there is watching. Someone up there knows more than you. The size of the cabin depended entirely on the ship. On a small sloop, which pirates preferred for speed and the ability to slip into shallow coastal inlets, the captain's quarters could be no bigger than a modern walk-in closet, 8 by 10 feet, enough room for a hammock, 1 chest, and a small table. That was it. On a larger captured frigate, the cabin could span the full width of the stern. Actual windows, a real desk, room to take a few steps in different directions without immediately hitting a wall. But even on the largest vessels, even those where a legitimate captain had installed fine furnishings and a decent wine supply, pirates transformed all of it within 3 months. Salt ate through the polish. The smell of gunpowder and tar and human sweat soaked into every crack. Knives left marks on tables. Bottles left rings, and only the essentials remained unchanged. Charts, a compass, the ship's articles, and the man who sat over all of it and thought. Because thinking was the primary occupation of a pirate captain when there was no battle to fight. The most important object in the captain's cabin was not gold and not weapons. It was charts. Navigational charts of the Caribbean and the Atlantic were the most valuable property on a pirate ship. Far more valuable than the plunder sitting in the holds, because plunder could be spent. A chart gave you the ability to find new plunder. The problem was that the charts of that era were terrible, not because the cartographers were incompetent, but because nobody actually knew precisely where anything was. Coastlines were drawn inaccurately. Depths were measured approximately. Sandbars and reefs appeared on charts with significant delays relative to the moment they had already sunk several ships. On top of that, competing naval powers deliberately falsified their own charts. The British introduced errors into maps that Spanish sailors might capture. The Spanish did the same to British routes. Pirates stole charts from every vessel they took, and whenever possible, laid them over each other, trying to work out where the truth was among the contradictions. The best captains accumulated their own records, personally measured depths, locations of fresh water sources on remote islands, entrances to hidden bays where you could wait out a hurricane or hide from a warship. These annotated charts, with their personal markings and notes, were the captain's intellectual property. Sometimes they were worth more than everything else in the cabin combined. Alongside the charts sat the navigational instruments. A quadrant for measuring the angle of the sun above the horizon gave you latitude, the answer to how far north or south the ship was. Longitude was a much harder problem. The chronometer that eventually solved it did not become widely available until the 1760s. During the Golden Age, captains determined their east-west position through a method called dead reckoning. You know where you started, you know your heading and your approximate speed. You multiply by time. You get an approximate position. Approximate. That is the key word. Errors accumulated. After 2 weeks at sea without landmarks, a captain could be off by dozens of miles in either direction. And dozens of miles of error is exactly how you end up on a reef instead of in open water. This meant every morning in the captain's cabin began with calculations. Where are we? Where were we yesterday? Where do we need to be in 3 days? Is there enough fresh water to reach the next island? Are we sailing toward a sandbar that was marked incorrectly on the chart? This was not romance. This was the mathematics of survival. And how well the captain could perform that mathematics determined whether he and his crew made it through the next month. The second most important object in the cabin was the ship's articles. The document every member of the crew signed, or marked with an X, before going to sea, the Pirate Constitution. The articles covered everything: how plunder was divided, what compensation a man received for wounds taken in battle, loss of the right hand, 600 reals, loss of the left, 500, loss of an eye, 100. What happened to the man who stole from a shipmate? What happened to the man who showed cowardice in a fight? The captain kept this document in his cabin, and that gave it a symbolic weight that went beyond its practical function. The articles lived in the captain's room, meaning he was responsible for protecting them, meaning he himself was bound by the same rules as every ordinary sailor, because without that, the entire structure collapsed. One more essential element of the cabin was the chest, heavy, iron-banded, locked. It held the captain's personal belongings, navigational instruments he considered his own property, documents, clothing, sometimes a Bible. Yes, many pirates were religious, or at least superstitious enough to keep religious texts close. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of the Golden Age, with more than 400 captured vessels to his name, kept a Bible and, by all accounts, felt something close to genuine discomfort when those around him blasphemed too aggressively, which is a remarkable contradiction for a man who had robbed 400 ships. But that is exactly what they were, not cartoon villains, people with their own internal logic and their own limits and their own peculiarities. And all of those peculiarities lived right here in the cabin. Here is what nobody tells you about pirate captains. They were not absolute rulers, they were elected officials. On a pirate ship, the captain was chosen by majority vote of the crew, and removed by majority vote just as easily. This was not some theoretical democratic principle that never got applied in practice. It happened constantly. Crews replaced captains who made bad decisions, who were seen as cowards, who tried to take more than their fair share. The captain had unchecked authority in exactly 2 situations. During battle, when his word was absolute law because otherwise the ship simply could not function. And during navigation, when his expertise was genuinely irreplaceable. At all other times, the crew governed itself through collective decision-making. What did this mean for the man sitting in that cabin? Paranoia, constant, grinding paranoia. The captain's cabin was not just a living space, it was a political headquarters. Every decision the captain made, from choosing the next target to how provisions were distributed during a lean stretch, had to be calculated not just for tactical advantage, but for how the crew would receive it. Take too much and they vote you out. Take too little and they decide you are weak. Show mercy to a captured crew and part of the ship calls you soft. Show no mercy and another part starts whispering that you are losing control. A significant portion of the captain's time in that cabin was spent not on charts and not on plunder, but on thinking about the crew. Not because he loved them, because they could kill him. Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, understood this dynamic instinctively. Historical accounts show that Blackbeard deliberately cultivated a terrifying persona. The slow-burning fuses woven into his beard during battle, the theatrical cruelty, the demonic appearance he maintained and refined. These were not the actions of a madman. This was calculated brand management from a leader who understood that fear is a more reliable management tool than affection. And a significant part of that persona was developed and refined right here in the cabin, in silence, behind a locked door, where nobody could see that the man behind the demon was simply thinking very carefully about how to stay in power. Samuel Bellamy, known as Black Sam, chose the opposite approach. Bellamy was charismatic and genuinely populist. He saw piracy as a rebellion against the wealthy classes that had closed off any legitimate path to prosperity for men like him. His cabin, by contemporary accounts, felt less like a throne room and more like an open office where crew members felt comfortable raising concerns. Bellamy died in 1717 when his ship, the Widow, went down in a nor'easter off Cape Cod. But in 1984, underwater explorer Barry Clifford located the wreck. Among the artifacts pulled from the seafloor were objects from that same cabin: navigational instruments, pistols, gold jewelry. A small silk pouch containing what may have been Bellamy's personal valuables. 300 years on the ocean floor, and still that room told its story through the objects that had lived inside it. The most important person in a pirate captain's life was not the first mate and not the best gunner. It was the quartermaster. If the captain was the ship's chief executive, then the quartermaster was simultaneously chief financial officer and chief operating officer. Elected not by the captain, but by the crew itself. The quartermaster controlled the distribution of food and water and plunder, resolved conflicts between crew members, administered punishments for violations of the articles. In certain practical terms, the quartermaster held more day-to-day power than the captain, and the meetings between them inside the captain's cabin behind a closed door were where all the genuinely important decisions actually happened. Picture those meetings. Two men who needed each other but did not necessarily trust each other, sitting across a table in a dark, rocking room, trying to figure out how to keep 100 armed criminals happy enough not to mutiny, where to sail next, whether the provisions would hold, whether that rumor about a Spanish treasure fleet was worth chasing across 3 weeks of open ocean, whether the new men pressed into service from the last captured vessel could be trusted, whether that group of sailors whispering in the corner for the 3rd night in a row was planning something or just playing cards. These were the real conversations of pirate command, not "where's the treasure?" More like, if we do not find a prize within 2 weeks, half the crew will demand we put into port. And if we put into port, 20 men will desert. And if 20 men desert, we do not have enough hands to work the ship. Provisions were their own separate headache. The standard pirate diet consisted of ship's biscuit, a rock-hard cracker that could technically last for years, but was barely edible under any circumstances. Salt pork and beef preserved in brine barrels, dried peas or beans when available, and whatever fresh food could be stolen, caught, or foraged on shore. Sea turtles were a prized catch in the Caribbean. Fish, too, though fishing required stopping, or at least significantly slowing the ship, which was dangerous anywhere near a naval patrol route. But the sharpest problem was always water. Fresh water stored in wooden barrels began turning green with algae within a few weeks. One period account describes the taste as drinking from a ditch. Beer and rum lasted longer, which is partly why pirates drank so much of it. But alcohol dehydrated the body and clouded judgment, which meant the captain had to constantly balance the crew's desire to drink against the practical need to keep them functional and combat ready. All of this logistics planning happened in the cabin with the quartermaster, reviewing the stores, calculating how many days remained before levels became critical, adjusting the route based on available resources. Run out of water 3 days from land and you have a mutiny. Run out of rum and you might have one sooner. There is one more aspect of the captain's cabin that almost nobody talks about: loneliness. The concept of the loneliness of command is something we usually associate with modern military leadership or corporate executives, but for pirate captains, it carried a particular intensity that deserves its own attention. The captain was socially isolated by necessity. He could not drink freely with the crew because he needed to maintain authority and keep his judgment sharp. He could not form close friendships with individual sailors without creating jealousy and factionalism. He could not share doubts about the route or their chances because uncertainty breeds panic. And he could not complain about the burden of command to anyone on board because showing weakness invited challenge. The cabin was the only place where the performance could stop. Behind that locked door, the captain could be uncertain, could be afraid, could sit at his desk and stare at a chart and quietly acknowledge to himself that he had no idea where that rumored Spanish fleet actually was, that the water supply was worrying, that 3 crew members had been whispering together for 3 days now, and it looked a lot like a conspiracy. Some captains handled this isolation through cruelty. Charles Vane was known for his brutality, and historical accounts suggest that his viciousness was at least partly a response to the relentless pressure of command. If everyone fears you, nobody conspires against you. In theory. In practice, his own crew eventually voted him out and replaced him with his first mate, a man named Calico Jack Rackham. Bartholomew Roberts took a completely different approach. He ran a famously disciplined ship. His articles prohibited gambling on board, prohibited candles after 8 in the evening, prohibited women disguised in men's clothing aboard the ship, which, given that it required a specific written rule, was apparently a frequent enough issue to warrant one. Roberts maintained his authority not through fear, but through consistent results. He took prize after prize, his crew got rich, and as long as the money kept coming, they followed his rules. More than 400 captured vessels over his career, the record of the entire Golden Age, and nobody came close. And all of it started with those same morning calculations at the same table in that same small room. One more thing worth knowing. What happened to the cabin during battle? When a pirate ship engaged a target, the cabin transformed completely. The stern windows, when the ship had them, were sometimes shuttered or removed entirely to prevent glass shrapnel from cannon fire. On some ships, the walls of the captain's cabin were temporary partitions that could be broken down and stowed to open up the gun deck. Furniture was moved or lashed down. Charts and instruments were locked in the chest. During the fight, the captain was on deck directing the action. The cabin stood empty or was filled with the wounded being dragged in from the fighting. Cannon fire at close range could, and frequently did, tear straight through the stern of a ship. The captain's cabin sat directly in the line of fire from any vessel in pursuit. More than one pirate captain returned after a battle to find his quarters destroyed, his possessions scattered, his charts soaked through with blood. After a successful engagement, the cabin became a sorting room. Captured cargo was inventoried, and while the main body of plunder was divided on the open deck in full view of everyone, the captain and quartermaster conducted their initial assessment in the relative privacy of the cabin. This was a delicate moment. The crew expected complete transparency. Any suspicion that the captain was skimming before the count would ignite the ship. But the captain also needed to set aside navigational instruments, charts, weapons, and other operationally critical items before the crew started dividing everything in reach. That is what the captain's cabin actually was. Not a throne room, not a treasury. A room where the person who had taken on command paid for that command every single day, in the form of isolation and paranoia and survival mathematics and the requirement to perform a role that could never be publicly set down. The cabin was the only place where the mask could slip for a moment. Behind a locked door, in the dark and the creak of timber. The next time you watch a pirate film and the camera sweeps through a captain's cabin with its enormous desk and globe and floor-to-ceiling windows, remember what it actually was. A room the size of your bathroom, with a hammock, a locked chest, a stack of stained charts, and a lantern that had to be handled carefully because one careless moment could burn the entire ship to the waterline. In that room, men made decisions that terrified the Royal Navy and every merchant fleet sailing the Atlantic, not because the room was grand, because the man inside it had no choice but to be.